Marriage wasn't supposed to feel this way. When Ethan and I first got married, everything felt electric, every glance, every touch, every laugh. But now, 6 years in, things were different. It wasn't that we didn't love each other anymore, we did. It was just, quieter now. Routine had taken over our lives. Between his long hours at the office and my constant juggling of work and managing the household, we barely had time to talk about anything beyond grocery lists and schedules. And in the rare moments we found ourselves alone together, the spark that used to light up our nights seemed nowhere to be found. One evening, after we both collapsed on the couch from exhaustion, I glanced over at Ethan. He was scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the soft blue glow. "We haven't," I began, my voice trailing off as I tried to find the right words. "Haven't what?" he asked, not looking up. "You know," I said, feeling my cheeks flush. Ethan set his phone down, finally meeting my gaze. "Oh." It wasn't an accusation or a complaint, it was just acknowledgement. But the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The truth was, our intimacy issues weren't new, they'd been creeping up on us for months, maybe even years. But until now, I'd pushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself that this was just how things were for married couples. But was it? I remembered how we used to be, the playful teasing, the stolen moments of passion, the way Ethan used to look at me like I was the most beautiful thing in the world. I missed that version of us, and I wondered if he did too. The tension finally boiled over one night after dinner. Ethan had been unusually quiet, and when I asked if something was wrong, he just shrugged. "Ethan," I said, my voice firm. "Talk to me." He sighed, setting his fork down. "I don't know, Lily. I feel like, we're off. Like we're not really connecting anymore." His words stung, but they weren't surprising. "I feel it too," I admitted. "Then why don't we do something about it?" he asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We keep pretending like everything's fine, but it's not." "I don't know how," I said softly, tears pricking my eyes. Ethan reached for my hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Maybe we figure it out together." The next evening, after the kids were in bed and the house was quiet, Ethan and I sat down with cups of tea and a shared determination to have an honest conversation. "I don't want you to feel like I don't love you," I began, my voice trembling. "Because I do. So much. But I think we've both let life get in the way of us." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I feel the same way. And I hate that we've let it get to this point." For the next hour, we talked, really talked. About how tired we both felt all the time, about how hard it was to switch from parent mode or work mode to being a couple again. About how we missed the intimacy we used to have, not just physically, but emotionally. "It's not that I don't want to," Ethan said, his voice full of vulnerability. "Sometimes I just don't know how to start." "I get it," I said, squeezing his hand. "And I think I feel the same way." By the end of the conversation, we'd both agreed on one thing: we needed to make our relationship a priority again. We decided to start small, setting aside one evening a week just for us. No phones, no distractions, just time to be together. "It doesn't have to be anything fancy," Ethan said. "Even just sitting on the couch and talking would be a good start." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in months. "I'd like that." Our first official date night was simple but meaningful. We ordered takeout from our favorite Thai place and played a board game we hadn't touched in years. At first, it felt awkward, like we were trying too hard. But as the night went on, the laughter started to come naturally again. "You still cheat at this," Ethan teased as I strategically moved my game pieces. "Do not," I shot back, grinning. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like we were us again. The weeks that followed weren't perfect, but they were progress. We started leaving little notes for each other, on the fridge, in the car, tucked into the pages of a book. Ethan surprised me with flowers one afternoon, and I made his favorite dinner the next night. The small gestures added up, creating a sense of closeness that had been missing for so long. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, Ethan reached for my hand. "I feel like we're finding our way back to each other," he said, his voice soft but steady. I smiled, leaning against him. "Me too." It wasn't a dramatic declaration or a grand gesture, it was just a quiet moment of connection. But it felt like a promise, one we were both ready to keep. Things didn't magically improve overnight. The cracks in our relationship didn't seal themselves with one date night or a few kind words. But for the first time in years, Ethan and I were talking, really talking, and that felt like a step in the right direction. One of the biggest challenges we faced was finding time for each other amidst the chaos of daily life. Between work, the kids, and the never-ending list of responsibilities, it felt like there was always something demanding our attention. One night, as we cleaned up after dinner, Ethan brought it up. "I think we need to set some boundaries," he said, rinsing a plate. "Boundaries?" I asked, drying a glass. "For us," he said, turning to face me. "We keep putting everything else ahead of our relationship, and it's not working. What if we set aside time, like, real, uninterrupted time, for just the two of us? No work, no phones, no distractions." I hesitated, the idea both appealing and daunting. "I like that. But what about the kids? And work? And everything else?" Ethan smiled, his expression patient. "We'll figure it out. Even if it's just 30 minutes a day, it's a start." The next evening, we started what we called our check-in ritual. After the kids were in bed, we'd sit down together, sometimes with tea, sometimes with wine, and talk about our day. At first, it felt forced, like we were following a script. But as the days went on, the conversations became more natural. "How was work?" I asked one night, curling up on the couch beside Ethan. "Busy," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I got a lot done. How about you?" "I finished organizing the gallery schedule," I said. "And I started thinking about that new project I mentioned." "That's great," Ethan said, his smile warm. "What's the project?" As I explained my ideas, I noticed the way he listened, really listened. It wasn't just polite nodding or waiting for his turn to speak. He was engaged, curious, invested. It reminded me of the early days of our relationship, when we'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Ethan started surprising me in little ways. One morning, I woke up to find my favorite coffee waiting for me on the counter, a sticky note attached to the mug, "You've got this. Love, Ethan." Another evening, I found a playlist on my phone titled "For Lily," filled with songs that had meant something to us over the years. I tried to reciprocate in my own way. I'd pack him lunch with handwritten notes tucked inside, or send him encouraging texts during his busiest workdays. They were small gestures, but they reminded us both that we were thinking of each other, even when life was hectic. As our connection grew stronger, I started to feel ready to address the part of our relationship we'd both been avoiding, our intimacy issues. One night, as we lay in bed, I turned to Ethan, my heart pounding. "Can we talk about something?" I asked. "Of course," he said, his tone calm but curious. "I've been thinking about us," I began, choosing my words carefully. "About how things used to be, and how they are now." Ethan nodded, waiting for me to continue. "I miss the way we were," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I miss feeling close to you in that way." His expression softened, and he reached for my hand. "I miss it too," he said. "I think we've both been so caught up in everything else that we've let that part of our relationship slip away." "It's not that I don't want to," I said quickly. "Sometimes I just feel disconnected." "I get it," Ethan said, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "And I don't want you to feel pressured." I want us to figure this out together, in a way that feels right for both of us." His patience and understanding brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said softly. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. "We'll figure it out." We started small, focusing on rebuilding intimacy outside of the bedroom. Holding hands more often, stealing kisses in the kitchen, curling up together on the couch, it was like rediscovering the little things that had drawn us to each other in the first place. One evening, as we danced in the living room to an old song from our wedding, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. "You're still a terrible dancer," I teased, laughing as Ethan stepped on my foot. "And you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he said, his voice soft but sincere. I rolled my eyes, but his words stayed with me long after the music stopped. The turning point came during a weekend getaway we'd planned together, a small cabin by the lake, far away from the noise of everyday life. With no distractions, we had time to focus on just being with each other. We went for long walks, played board games, and talked about everything from our dreams to our fears. One night, as we sat by the fire, Ethan turned to me and said, "I feel like we're us again." I smiled, tears pricking my eyes. "Me too." For all the progress Ethan and I had made, I knew better than to expect perfection. Rebuilding something as fragile as intimacy wasn't a straight line, it was a winding road, full of detours and bumps. But knowing that didn't make it easier to handle the moments when we stumbled. It started with a busy week. Work deadlines, a last-minute project for me, and an unexpected work trip for Ethan had both of us running on empty. By the time Friday night rolled around, we were both too exhausted to talk, let alone spend quality time together. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a familiar ache creep into my chest. The distance between us wasn't intentional, but it still felt heavy. The next morning, Ethan noticed. "You okay?" he asked as we sat at the breakfast table. "Yeah," I said automatically, not meeting his eyes. He reached across the table, placing his hand over mine. "Lily, if something's bothering you, I want to know. Please don't shut me out." His words softened the knot in my chest. I feel like we've been slipping again this week," I admitted. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I feel it too. But it's just a rough week. We'll get through it." His reassurance was simple but steady, and it reminded me that we were in this together. After that conversation, Ethan and I decided to create a plan for the inevitable off weeks. "We need a reset button," he said one evening as we brainstormed. "What kind of reset button?" I asked, curious. "Something simple," he said. "Like, if we're feeling disconnected, we stop everything and take 20 minutes to focus on each other. No matter what else is going on." I smiled at the idea. "I like that. It doesn't have to be complicated, just intentional." We agreed to give it a try, and the following week, we put it into practice. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Ethan came home and said, "Reset." "Reset," I agreed. We sat on the couch, holding hands and talking about our days. It wasn't dramatic or life-changing, but it was enough to remind us that we were a team. Despite our efforts, there were still moments when the old doubts crept back in, moments when I wondered if we'd ever fully regain what we'd lost. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, I found myself voicing those fears. "What if this is as good as it gets?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan set down the dish he was drying and turned to face me. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we're just pretending? What if we never really get back to how we used to be?" Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "Lily, I don't want us to go back to how we used to be." I frowned, confused. "You don't?" "No," he said, stepping closer. "I want us to be better. Stronger. And I think we're getting there, even if it doesn't always feel that way." His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Over time, I started to notice the small wins, the moments that reminded me of why Ethan and I had fallen in love in the first place. Like the way he'd surprise me with my favorite dessert after a long day, or the way we'd laugh uncontrollably over a silly inside joke. One evening, as we danced in the kitchen to a song from our wedding playlist, I felt the spark of something familiar. "You know you're still a terrible dancer, right?" I teased. "And you're still the most beautiful woman in the world," he replied, his smile soft. As our emotional connection grew stronger, the physical side of our relationship began to feel more natural. It started with small moments, holding hands more often, lingering hugs, kisses that weren't rushed. Those gestures built a foundation of trust and comfort, making it easier to reconnect in deeper ways. One night, as we lay in bed, Ethan turned to me and said, "Thank you." "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For sticking with me," he said. "For believing in us." His gratitude brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely audible. "For never giving up." To celebrate our progress, Ethan and I planned another weekend getaway, this time to a cozy bed and breakfast in the mountains. The trip was exactly what we needed. With no distractions, we spent our days hiking, exploring the small town, and talking about everything from our favorite childhood memories to our hopes for the future. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Ethan reached for my hand. "Lily," he said softly, "I feel like we're us again. The best version of us." I smiled, leaning into him. "Me too." As we drove home from the trip, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan and I still had work to do, our journey wasn't over. But we'd come so far, and I knew we were both committed to continuing to grow, together. When Ethan and I pulled into the driveway after our weekend away, I sat for a moment before getting out of the car, just letting the quiet hum of the engine settle in my chest. The trip had been restorative in ways I hadn't anticipated, but now, back home, the real world loomed large again. The spark we'd begun to rediscover felt fragile, like a flame that needed tending to keep burning. "We'll keep this going, right?" I asked, glancing at Ethan. He turned off the car and reached for my hand. "We will," he said, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning." Ethan and I started weaving small rituals into our daily life to maintain the connection we'd worked so hard to rebuild. Every morning, we'd take 5 minutes to drink coffee together before the chaos of the day began. Sometimes we'd talk about what lay ahead, other times, we'd just sit in comfortable silence. In the evenings, we started cooking dinner together, a task that used to feel like a chore but now became a way to unwind and share a laugh. One night, as I struggled to chop an onion without crying, Ethan handed me a pair of ridiculous goggles he'd found in the junk drawer. "Try these," he said, grinning. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the knife. "You're ridiculous." "Yeah," he said, wrapping an arm around my waist. "But you love it." He wasn't wrong. Of course, life wasn't without its challenges. Work stress, family obligations, and the daily grind still tested our patience and pulled us in different directions. One evening, after a particularly hectic day, I found myself snapping at Ethan over something trivial, a misplaced receipt or an unfinished task, I couldn't even remember. "Lily, what's really going on?" he asked gently, his calm response diffusing my frustration. I sighed, sitting down at the table. "I'm just overwhelmed. It feels like no matter how much we try, there's always more to do." Ethan sat across from me, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe we're trying to do too much. We don't have to fix everything all at once." His words were a reminder that progress didn't have to be perfect. One of the things I'd missed most in our marriage was the playfulness we'd had in the early years, the inside jokes, the silly games, the moments of pure, unfiltered joy. So one weekend, I decided to surprise Ethan with a date that leaned into that spirit. "Bowling," he said, raising an eyebrow as we pulled into the alley. "Don't knock it till you try it," I said, grabbing his hand and pulling him inside. We spent the evening laughing at each other's terrible form, celebrating strikes with exaggerated cheers, and groaning over gutter balls. By the time we left, my cheeks hurt from smiling so much. "I haven't had that much fun in ages," Ethan said as we walked to the car. "Me neither," I admitted, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. As our emotional connection deepened, the physical side of our relationship began to feel more natural. It wasn't about grand gestures or elaborate plans, it was about the small moments of closeness we shared every day. Like the way Ethan would rest his hand on my lower back when we passed each other in the kitchen. Or the way I'd curl up against him on the couch, his arm draped around my shoulders. Those moments built a foundation of trust and comfort, making it easier to reignite the spark we'd both missed. One night, as we lay in bed, Ethan surprised me with a question. "What's something you've always wanted to do but never told me about?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I said, stalling. "Come on," he said, turning to face me. "There's got to be something." I thought for a moment, then said, "I've always wanted to take a pottery class." "Pottery?" he repeated, his smile soft. "Yeah," I said, feeling self-conscious. "I think it'd be fun to make something with my hands, you know." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Let's do it." "What?" I asked, laughing. "Let's sign up for a class," he said. "Together." A few weeks later, Ethan and I found ourselves in a small studio, surrounded by spinning wheels and lumps of clay. At first, it was a disaster. My first attempt at a bowl looked more like a pancake, and Ethan accidentally sent his clay flying across the room. But as the evening went on, we started to get the hang of it. "Yours actually looks like a bowl," I said, admiring Ethan's work. "Yeah, but yours has character," he said, grinning. By the end of the class, we were covered in clay and laughing like we hadn't laughed in years. That night, as we drove home, Ethan reached for my hand. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For sharing this with me," he said. "For letting us have fun again." His gratitude brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said. "For always being willing to try." As Ethan and I continued to grow together, I realized that our journey wasn't about recapturing the past, it was about creating something new, something stronger. We weren't the same people we were when we first got married, but that was okay. What mattered was that we were choosing each other, every day, and finding joy in the process. Ethan and I had come a long way. The routines that once drained us felt lighter now, and the connection we'd worked so hard to rebuild had started to feel natural again. But life, as it always does, had a way of testing us. One particularly hectic week, it felt like everything hit at once. Work deadlines piled up for both of us, one of the kids got sick, and the leaky faucet in the kitchen turned into a full-blown plumbing disaster. By Friday, Ethan and I were both running on fumes. "I'll handle the plumber," Ethan said that evening as he sorted through a pile of bills. "I can call them," I offered, though the thought of adding one more thing to my plate made my head spin. "No, it's fine," Ethan said, his tone clipped. I flinched at the edge in his voice. "Okay," I said quietly, retreating to the living room. For the rest of the evening, we moved around each other in silence, too tired to talk. The next morning, Ethan found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring into my coffee. "Hey," he said, sitting across from me. "I think we need a reset." I looked up, surprised by his honesty. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think we do." We decided to spend the day doing nothing but reconnecting. No work, no chores, no to-do lists, just us. We started with a walk in the park, the crisp autumn air refreshing after a week of chaos. As we strolled, Ethan reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "Sorry if I was short with you yesterday," he said. "I was just overwhelmed." "Me too," I admitted. "But I don't want us to take it out on each other." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "We won't. We're in this together, remember?" One of the things that always brought us back to each other was laughter. That afternoon, as we cleaned out the garage together, a task we'd been avoiding for months, Ethan found an old box of costumes from a Halloween party years ago. "Think this still fits?" he asked, holding up a ridiculous pirate hat. I laughed as he plopped it onto his head, striking a dramatic pose. "You look ridiculous." "Ridiculously handsome," he corrected, making me laugh even harder. By the end of the day, the garage was only half cleaned, but my heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. One of the biggest lessons we'd learned was that intimacy wasn't just about physical connection, it was about feeling seen, valued, and loved. Ethan and I started carving out time for moments of closeness, even when life felt busy. Some nights, we'd sit on the couch and read together, our feet tangled under a shared blanket. Other nights, we'd light candles at the dinner table, turning a simple meal into something special. It wasn't always grand or romantic, but it reminded us of the love we shared. As we grew closer, I started opening up to Ethan about insecurities I hadn't voiced before. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I said, "Sometimes I worry that I'm not enough for you." Ethan turned to me, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Lily, why would you think that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe because I'm not the same person I was when we first got married. I'm older, more tired. Sometimes I feel like I've lost the version of myself you fell in love with." Ethan reached for my hand, his grip firm. "Lily, I didn't fall in love with a version of you. I fell in love with you. And I still do, every day." His words brought tears to my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I believed him. As Ethan and I continued to grow, we started talking more about our goals, not just as individuals, but as a couple. "What's one thing you've always wanted to do together?" Ethan asked one night as we lay in bed. I thought for a moment, then said, "Travel. Not just a quick trip, but a real adventure. Somewhere neither of us has been before." Ethan smiled. "I'd love that. Let's make it happen." We started planning a trip, a goal to look forward to and work toward together. One habit we started was sharing something we were grateful for at the end of each day. "I'm grateful you made time for us today," Ethan said one evening, his voice soft. "I'm grateful for you being patient with me," I replied, smiling. It was a simple practice, but it helped us end each day on a positive note, no matter how stressful things had been. By the time winter rolled around, Ethan and I had found a rhythm that worked for us. We weren't perfect, and we didn't expect to be. But we were learning how to show up for each other in ways that mattered, and that made all the difference. One night, as we sat by the fire with mugs of cocoa, Ethan said, "You know, I think we're stronger now than we've ever been." "I think so too," I said, leaning against him. It wasn't just wishful thinking, it was a truth we'd earned, one moment at a time. It's funny how life has a way of testing the things you think you've figured out. By the time the new year rolled around, Ethan and I had settled into a groove, steady, supportive, and full of little rituals that kept us connected. But no relationship is static. Life kept moving, and with it came new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to grow together. In February, Ethan got an unexpected offer at work, a promotion that would mean a significant pay raise but also longer hours and more travel. "I don't know if I should take it," he said one evening as we sat on the couch, the offer letter open on his lap. "What's holding you back?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You," he said simply. "Us. I don't want to undo all the progress we've made. What if this job takes me away from you?" His honesty made my chest ache, but I forced myself to smile. "We've worked through so much, Ethan. If this is something you want, we'll figure it out. Together." Ethan accepted the promotion, and for a while, it felt like we were juggling a dozen plates in the air. His new role kept him busy, and I found myself stepping up more at home. It wasn't easy, but we found ways to adapt. One evening, after Ethan returned from a 3-day work trip, he surprised me with a bouquet of wildflowers. "For you," he said, his smile tired but genuine. "They're beautiful," I said, taking the flowers and kissing his cheek. "Not as beautiful as you," he replied, wrapping his arms around me. Moments like that reminded me why we worked so hard to prioritize each other. But even with our best efforts, there were moments when the distance felt too wide. One Friday evening, Ethan called to say he'd be late, again. I'd been looking forward to our weekly date night, but as the hours ticked by, my disappointment turned to frustration. When he finally walked through the door, I was sitting at the kitchen table, my arms crossed. "I'm sorry," he said, setting his bag down. "The meeting ran over." "You could have called," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You're right," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I should have. But Lily, I'm doing my best." His words deflated my anger, and I sighed. "I know you are. I miss you." Ethan crossed the room and pulled me into a hug. "I miss you too. And I'll try to do better." A few weeks later, Ethan surprised me with a weekend getaway, just the two of us. "We need some time to reconnect," he said as we packed our bags. The trip was exactly what we needed. We spent our days exploring a quaint little town, indulging in lazy breakfasts at the inn, and walking hand in hand along quiet trails. One evening, as we sat by a crackling fire, Ethan turned to me and said, "I don't say it enough, but I'm so grateful for you, Lily. For your patience, your strength, and the way you always believe in us." Tears pricked my eyes, and I smiled. "I'm grateful for you too. For always showing up, even when it's hard." As the months passed, Ethan's work demands eased slightly, giving us more time to focus on our shared goals. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sunset, Ethan brought up the trip we'd talked about months ago. "Do you still want to travel?" he asked. "Of course," I said. "Let's make it happen," he said, his smile full of determination. We spent the next few weeks planning a trip, a week in Italy, exploring art, history, and food. It felt like a dream, but it was a dream we were building together. The trip was everything I'd hoped for and more. We wandered through cobblestone streets, marveled at ancient architecture, and ate more pasta than I thought was humanly possible. One evening, as we watched the sun set over a vineyard, Ethan took my hand. "This is what I want for us," he said. "A life full of moments like this." "Me too," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder. The trip wasn't just a vacation, it was a reminder of why we'd chosen each other, and why we continued to choose each other every day. When we returned home, life resumed its usual rhythm, but something felt different. Stronger. Ethan and I weren't perfect, but we'd learned how to navigate the imperfections together. We'd learned how to communicate, how to compromise, and how to keep the flame alive even in the face of life's challenges. One evening, as we sat on the couch with cups of tea, I turned to Ethan and said, "I feel like we've built something really strong." He smiled, taking my hand. "We have. And we'll keep building it, no matter what." As the years went on, Ethan and I faced new challenges and celebrated new milestones. But through it all, the foundation we'd created remained steady, a testament to the love, patience, and effort we'd poured into our marriage. And as I looked at him one quiet evening, his hand resting in mine, I knew that no matter what the future held, we'd face it together.